Hi, I'm Jess, part-time hobbit, and I'm here to talk to you about... Well, this doesn't technically have anything to do with Tolkien, but I figure if you like him, you'll probably like this, so it's fine. I ate like a medieval peasant for a week. And before you ask, no, I didn't develop scurvy or malnutrition or alcoholism or anything like that. But I did get some fascinating insight into the daily lives of historical people, and I can't wait to walk you guys through my week. As a disclaimer, I am not an expert in this subject, and I am merely human. So sometimes I do play things a little bit fast and loose in terms of historical accuracy, but please rest assured that I did my best, and I am happy to receive constructive critique in the comments. So let's get into the parameters of this little experiment. First off, location. Diet in the Middle Ages was incredibly dependent on where you were located more than anything else. Today, we have access to food from literally all over the world, just a 15-minute drive away at a grocery store. But for the most part, in the Middle Ages, things were much less globalized, and you only had access to what was around you. Most of the research that I found was about England in the Middle Ages, but in order to narrow that down a little bit further, I chose the homeland of my own British ancestors, the Cheviot Hills on the border between England and Scotland. Fun little aside, my ancestors in this area were recorded as having been horse traders of ill repute, which, you know, take that as you will. They lived on the borderlands so that if things got a little too legally hot on one side of the border, they could hop over to the other country and trade horses there until things cooled down and they could go back. For our next parameter, let's talk about time. The medieval period as we know it was long, approximately 1,000 years, and believe it or not, both diet and lifestyle were not a monolith across those centuries. I decided to focus on the 14th century, which is where we first start to see written recipes appearing in the historical record. But let's talk about recipes. While we do have some recipes from this time, almost all of them are from the kitchens of the royal wealthy. More wealthy historians didn't think of peasant diets as something worth recording, and since literacy was practically non-existent for the rest of the population, there was no one around to write, much less read, Aunt Belinda's recipe for famous cow spleen stew. While I worked off of recipes in the places that I could, I was primarily left to look at the food available to them and the cooking methods available and extrapolate from there using my own cooking skills. Now we've been talking about food, but let's talk about drink. Ale was a pretty important part of the medieval peasant's diet, and they would have started drinking it in some form as early as the age of 5. But don't worry, it wasn't toddlers shotgunning natty lights like you're imagining. Beer was considered both clean to drink and highly nutritional. It was kind of thicker and less purified than modern ales, but that also meant that it was much lower in alcohol content. In fact, some monks referred to it as liquid bread due to its nutritional properties. Working men especially would have relied on ale as a major source of easy calories. Now, there is an urban myth that medieval people only drank beer or wine in place of water, and this is pretty categorically untrue. Most people did have access to fresh water or had methods for purifying it, and although they drank ale, they did rely on good old water for their hydration needs. However, this is a YouTube video, and quite frankly, I wanted to be able to put something about drinking beer in the thumbnail without it being clickbait. And so for my final parameter, I decided to drink at least a glass of beer with every meal that I had. Now, I couldn't get a hold of authentic medieval ale, and I didn't really want to spend my 7 free days in a full-on alcoholic haze. So I adjusted a modern beer to the alcohol percentage of a medieval beer. This ended up being a 1:2 ratio of beer to water, getting me to about a 1% alcohol. With those rules in place, let's talk about day 1, where I had yet to make any actual food. Oh, yum. To the pursuit of
the bag.
The bag. Yeah, I mean, that's watery beer.
That's a watered down beer. Don't drink and drive.
Yeah, don't. Even if it's watery beer, that's why I'm not working this week. It's not because I lost my job.
No, it's just sad.
I'm gonna take this morning to make some butter for later today. So I think I just have to shake this. This is just heavy cream. And shake we did for a long, long time. I rinsed the butter well under cold water and added some salt before sealing it into a container. So here we have lunch, the main meal of the day, and for that we have maca is the name of this, and I'll explain how to make it later. Now this is my bad, but I never actually got back around to that. However, if you do want to see this food being made, you can head over to the Tasting History channel here on YouTube and watch the illustrious Max Miller make the recipe that I followed. All of his videos are great, especially his medieval food playlist, which I referenced a ton for this video. The recipe is for maca, which is just boiled beans mashed up with a little bit of ale and topped with onions fried in butter. On the side is a loaf of sourdough that I made with some local stone ground wheat, rye, and barley. I'll explain more about the bread later because there were some incidents, but anyway, back to lunch.
Bone apple teeth.
Bone apple teeth. It is precisely what it is, you know, it's beans and onions.
Mm-hmm. And bread.
A bread too, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's like maybe a little bland, like I'd like it with a little garlic or something, but I can add that.
It tastes like food.
Yeah, if I was cold especially, this is very hearty.
Mm-hmm. It's like a combination between the mashed potatoes and going to Cracker Barrel and getting a bowl of pinto beans.
The bread's not great because it's all whole grain flours and no salt. It still tastes fine as a vehicle for food. I probably wouldn't go out and eat it on its own.
This is the kind of meal that I would have after a long day's work out in the field, plowing. I get in, I sit down, my loving wife, Belinda, has already made me some, and I go, "Argh," and I eat it up, I go to bed, and then I die at the age of 29.
In another lapse of judgment, I didn't record myself making green cheese either, but once again, I will link the Max Miller video that I used to make it. Cheese has been an accessible, low-cost way to preserve milk and provide protein since 8000 BCE. But the Middle Ages were actually really big on cheese, especially in monasteries. Monks dedicated a good deal of their time to perfecting cheese-making techniques, and it's within the medieval era that we start to see modern types of cheese develop. However, most people didn't have quite as much cheese-making free time as monks, so they settled for something more simple like this green cheese, which simply involves separating the curds or fat of the milk from the whey using an acid. The soft farmer's cheese that you're left with was a predecessor to modern cottage cheese and would have been used both in recipes and eaten plain. So here I am at dinner. I am now officially stationed in my kitchen since Dylan is gone. So I'm just having some leftover maca bread and a little bit of green cheese. And a little bit of green cheese with honey. The maca has definitely dried out, and I put it in the fridge because I will not get botulism even for a YouTube video. I think that I was expecting this to be cottage cheese, and it's not. This is, I would say, tangier than cottage cheese. I don't love it with the honey. That may have been my bad. I definitely need to eat a vegetable tomorrow. It looks like that is gonna be tomorrow's goal. I don't want to try and get a nice shot of this with my phone, so I'm gonna just bring this up here for y'all. Ta-da! I've got some bread with possibly too much butter, because I wanted it to taste good, and some cheese. The bread tastes vaguely like an antique store. And listen, I'm someone who likes whole grain bread. I grew up on whole grain bread, but this is a little grainy for me even. I'm gonna make a slightly larger loaf of bread today. I want coffee. I began day 2 with some delusions of grandeur about bread. Bread has been the staple of most civilizations' diets for millennia, and the Middle Ages was no different. In this era, white bread made from heavily sifted flour was the pinnacle of fine dining, whereas peasants were left to eat the actually much healthier whole grain bread. Their flour was incredibly coarse, often cut with barley, rye, or oats, and for the extremely poor, sometimes they would mix in lentils, acorns, or peas in order to bulk up the bread. Bread was an absolute staple, even for the poorest of poor, and should have been a major part of my diet. Should have been. I have made a decent amount of sourdough, even whole grain sourdoughs, and this was probably the one part of the process that I actually had some confidence in. So I'll just speed run you through my bread making process on day 2. I combined my whole grain, barley, and rye flour, mixing in enough water to dampen it before leaving it to soak in that water for an hour. After adding in a hefty scoop of my lively sourdough starter, Hank, I began a series of stretches and folds, a process which gently develops gluten within the dough. It was at this point that I realized my dough had the same texture as Play-Doh, which is not a good sign. I don't know what went wrong, but this dough just would not develop any kind of stretch, but against my better judgment, I left it like that to rise. Today we are going to be making some pottage for lunch and effectively dinner, because I'm not cooking twice today. As far as I'm aware, there aren't any extant recipes for pottage, because it was really the kind of thing where you put it together based off of the things that you had. Going into this pottage, we have some yellow and purple carrots. I guess go to Desk Jess for an aside on purple carrots. Thanks, Kitchen Jess. Carrots actually started out as purple and white. These carrots were a little bit more coarse and hardy than our modern day orange carrots, which were developed by the Dutch in the 17th century. You can still find these heirloom varieties of carrots in today's stores, but they're usually in the fancy organic section. Cut to Desk Jess for an aside on garlic. All right, well, that was pretty quick, but it's good to have y'all back. Garlic and onions were a major staple of the medieval peasants' diet. While the rich and fancy were off in their towers eating imported spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and sugar, the poor were left with the lowest of the low, garlic and onions. Back then, the line between food and medicine was pretty blurry, so garlic was also considered a remedy for many conditions, including infection, constipation, and heat stroke. I can neither confirm nor deny any of those medical claims. I will say that I really like onions and garlic, so I feel a little bit bad for those rich folks. Except that they were, largely able to sidestep the starving and filth and infestation. Okay, all things considered, they had it pretty good. At the base of our pottage, we are going to have a little bit of bacon. Now, cut to Jess for an aside on pork, I guess. Long time no see. Basically, meat was far too expensive and difficult to access for most medieval peasants. Cows, for example, were expensive, and even if a family could afford one, you would want to keep it around alive for as long as possible so that it could continue providing milk. Beef was also considered very unhealthy, the belief being that it would thicken your blood and cause depression. Yeah, medieval medicine is weird. They could have also raised chickens, but again, those were expensive, and you'd want to keep them around for their egg production. Even wild game like boar or deer were off limits, because their hunting grounds belonged to nobles, and the punishments for poaching were pretty severe. Pigs, however, could be raised in almost any environment, including the city, and had a wide range of possible diets, making them incredibly popular amongst the peasantry. They were also considered fairly healthy to eat. The book that I took most of my research from was also very clear in mentioning that physicians of the day said that it was similar in taste to human flesh. I don't entirely know why that would make it healthier, but yeah, medieval medicine is weird. This is not much, but it'll give us a little bit of fat and a little bit of protein. And then we're going to add some peas to add protein and fiber, just split peas. And then towards the end, we'll throw in a little bit of oatmeal to thicken everything up, as well as some parsley for flavor and kale. For the most part, this is gonna be it. So I'm gonna start prepping these veggies. I started by frying up the diced bacon before adding in the aromatics and allowing those to cook down a bit with the bacon. Once those were looking a little glassy, I added some ale and gave it a good stir before adding in the carrots, washed split peas, and water. And a little more beer. I added the chopped parsley and let all of that come down to a boil. This all came down to a nice purpley brown color, and I topped it off with some salt and oatmeal. Last but not least, I threw in some chopped kale. Cabbage was eaten throughout the Middle Ages across Europe, especially in pottages like this. But kale took the role of cabbage specifically in Scotland. Since I'm operating on the Scottish border, I thought it was only appropriate to use kale here. Once the kale had a few minutes to kind of wilt down, it was time for lunch. It's time for lunch, baby. That soup, I think it would be better with broth. It improves the bread. It tastes like Colonial Williamsburg. I I think it is probably the cooking with ale that gives you the kind of vintage taste, but I mean, it's certainly not bad. Maybe I just need to stop putting ale into everything. If anything, I probably went a little too ham in terms of ingredients, because this is kind of like everything, but it's still good. I had plans to make rules for myself in terms of eating leftovers, which was going to be that I could only eat them on the same day as I made the food. However, I, as a person, am completely incapable of cooking food for one person to last me one day. And that right there, that is too much food to eat in a day. Well, that's soup, baby. After lunch, I finished up the bread for the day, shaping it and placing it into a lightly floured wicker banneton to proof somewhere cool overnight. I'm having some pottage with a little bit of bread and some bread with honey. I will say that as time has passed, there is less and less liquid in this. And by tomorrow, I suspect that there will be no liquid at all, which is cool, I guess. As of today, I can report that I do want to eat more sugar, but maybe it's just because I'm thinking about it, but I really, really want a piece of candy or some ice cream right now. And something that's not made with ale. I am excited to eat a little more tomorrow. This is fine. Well, folks, happy breakfast. It's bread and cheese. I think today's gonna be a good day. I arguably don't have as much to do as I did yesterday, which is always good. And this is officially the last of my bread, so I very much need more. You see, it's so funny that I mentioned that, because guess what? I didn't get that bread that I needed. I tried to play it cool and be excited for lunch, but you'll see. The window is open, because my kitchen is filled with smoke, but I am actually quite excited about this meal, because it's just salmon. The pottage is gonna taste the same, but the salmon, that I am excited for. However, before I get into that, I must admit my own failure, and that is this bread I made. I don't know if you're seeing this cross section, but it's essentially a frisbee, which is good, probably. So what happened here is I did not flour my banneton enough, and my dough was just too wet. And so when I was pulling it out of the banneton, the whole top just ripped off. So I currently am making a new loaf for tomorrow, but today I'm just not really gonna eat any bread, which is cool. That is our cross section. Oh boy, haha, okay. It is so wet. That has firmly lodged itself inside of my teeth. It's definitely undercooked on the inside, but that's my bad. That's good. I'm living off salmon this week. As an aside on salmon, fish was readily available to pretty much anybody who had access to water, and salmon especially was a cheap and easy source of protein for peasants. According to one source, apprentices had to put it in their contracts that their masters could only serve them salmon 3 times a week because they got so sick of it. What a world to live in. We'll see what I end up eating for dinner. I'm so happy to be eating something that I enjoy. Though my spirits were lifted by the salmon, the bread was a stupidly massive blow to my pride, especially considering that meant that I had to start on the next day's loaf that day. This approach was largely the same, except instead of those gentle stretch and folds that I did the first time, I did a more traditional knead for about 15 minutes. It was looking much less like Play-Doh compared to my last batch, so my hopes were fairly high. Now dinner presented an interesting conundrum. Without any bread to eat, just plain leftover cheese didn't really have a lot of appeal for me. So instead, I went with something a bit more avant-garde. I halved some pears, hollowed out the inside, and filled them with a mixture of oatmeal, butter, honey, and breadcrumbs. I then baked them until everything was soft. Pears were eaten throughout the Middle Ages in Europe, always cooked though, as it was thought that uncooked pears would cause colic. Medieval medicine. Maybe this meal is cheating. It's possible. This isn't, as far as I'm aware, based off of any particular medieval recipe. I don't have any proof that they didn't
make this. I hate to say this, but this would have been better with an apple, which I guess is my bad for not using the apple I also have, but I can recognize that this may not be the world's most healthy dinner, what with it being a pear and a half and some oatmeal. What can I say? It would be good with some cinnamon and brown sugar, but I mean, that's pretty good eating. I don't think I realized how much my mood was dependent on like eating food that I enjoyed. I thought I would coast through this week, and I haven't really. I feel like I may be starting to get a bit of a handle on this, but I'm not even halfway through yet. We'll see.
With that positively ringing endorsement, we moved on to day 4. This is probably a great time for me to talk about breakfast. And the bad news is that breakfast was largely not eaten throughout the Middle Ages. The first meal of the day would have been lunch, when the sun had come up and you'd already had the first half of the day to prepare your food. In fact, breakfast was considered by some to be lazy or immoral, since it meant that you were breaking your fast of the night early. However, I am merely human and chose to eat something for breakfast on most days. But hey, if you're not a breakfast person, the next time someone tells you it's the most important meal of the day, you could just call them a lazy, immoral coward. Something to think about.
You know what I don't want to do this morning? Drink beer. Well, it's a fast day today, which means no breakfast and no meat. At least that's how I'm doing it. It would kind of depend on exactly who you were and the lifestyle you were leading.
Hi, Editing Jess here. I never fully explained fast days. Fasting is abstaining from certain foods or drinks, and it's been a part of religious practice for centuries. This kind of voluntary sacrifice was meant to cleanse the body and soul and bring one closer to God. In the Middle Ages, Europe was largely Christian, and so they followed Christian fasting days, which at the time occurred all year round, sometimes multiple times a week. The typical medieval fast would cut out meat, eggs, and dairy. I broke the rules and ate dairy because I was dumb and didn't do enough research, but I hope y'all let that slide.
I'm going into today kind of hungry, but at least I have my breakfast beer. Am I right, guys?
For lunch, I made myself another pottage, this one simple and without any meat. I boiled some barley and split peas with a bit of butter and salt until they were both soft and well cooked. I then sauteed some onions and added those to the cooked barley and peas, along with fresh parsley and a bit of white wine vinegar.
I'm gonna show you my food here right off the bat. I gotta let you know that my bread... Focus. Oh no! My bread turned out bad. To be honest, I don't know what happened. It's gummy, it's bad, it is largely flat. But honestly, that's just gonna be how it is. But honestly, for the most part, I'm just gonna plan on not eating bread. That is solidly something I will make again. Fun fact, I was gonna have salmon today with lunch, and then I forgot to defrost it. So then I was gonna have this on some bread. But as you saw, the bread isn't really an option. I don't know what's wrong with me. This would be perfect with some salmon.
The footage was lost, but after lunch, I developed a sudden and very aggressive cold. I don't know exactly what happened, especially since it was pretty much gone the next day, but I developed a throbbing headache, sore throat, and head fog. It was really cool. I remedied this with some fresh ginger tea, which it would have been a little bit outside of my peasant-y price range, but I really didn't care at that point. The ginger cleared up my throat a little bit, but I wasn't feeling 100% at dinner time, especially considering my bread-related failures.
So this is tonight's dinner. I kind of cheated, but in my defense, I feel like underneath this you can't really see it, but I made a little flatbread for myself, and then I also just have some raw kale massaged with a little bit of vinegar. Okay, no. I am drinking this with water because it's very good and I want to enjoy it. Eating kale with a spoon is hard. I could, in theory, like wrap this all up, kind of like a giant terrifying taco.
I I started out day 5 with a little bit more vim and vigor, especially considering that I had officially chosen to give up on bread.
I guess I would call it marginally better this morning. I don't know, it's hard to tell because I always feel bad in the morning, so it's like, is this normal bad or is this sick bad? I'm gonna peel 3 hard-boiled eggs right now and eat the egg whites. I'd have it on bread, but whoopsie. I need the yolks because I'm gonna be making some meat pies this afternoon for lunch and dinner. Ignore my giant pile of drying dishes. Behold, a yolk. Truly, what better way to start your morning than with egg whites and beer?
For lunch, I made the aforementioned meat pies based off of this recipe from Max Miller.
I didn't record any of the actual making of these components. Basically what we have here is a hot water crust made with some whole wheat flour and a bit of lard and butter and, you know, hot water. And then here we have our meat pie filling, which is a bit of fried pork and chicken with some ginger and salt. I feel like rolling this out wasn't the best approach because it is just cracking. I just tore up a whole chunk of dough, but it's fine, it's fine, it's fine, guys, it's fine. Now lifting this off the table is not a great dough. I am never cooking with whole wheat flour again after this. This is fine. Shh. It's not fine. It is not fine. These look like geological formations of some kind. And not in like a tasty way.
This was perhaps a little bit more luxurious than the average peasant would have eaten, but I figured that everybody deserves a little treat sometimes.
I let these guys cool for about 10 minutes, but they turned out fairly well. Break off some of the crust, because you're not technically supposed to eat that, I believe. That's just there as like a holder. Very hot. That's way too hot to eat right now, so I'm gonna eat some of the filling. A little too salty, but there's no salt in the crust, so when I am able to get a proper bite of that, I'm sure it will balance out beautifully. It's very crumbly, which again, that's my bad. Oh, hot. A little bit of the ginger comes through. Honestly, the crust on its own is pretty good too, especially if it wasn't made with a whole grain flour. It's very oily because of the lard, but still good.
I did not end up eating all 3 of the pies, especially since I remembered that large quantities of lard upset my stomach, and I ended up having a bit of a lighter fare for dinner.
For dinner, I am having whatever is left of the pottage, which isn't very much, the pottage from yesterday, and some kale, because it was about to go bad, so, you know, I do what I gotta do. I mean, this is essentially eating raw kale as a meal, which probably isn't, like, the thing I dream of doing, but
Day 6 started out the way that in many of my days that week had begun, with the best part of a balanced breakfast.
well, that's breakfast, baby. It is a fast day today. I have very vague plans for my food today involving apples. I have a recipe that I'm gonna try. I had some plain oatmeal last night with a couple of drinks. Got pretty crazy. Today I am mostly gearing towards Saturday when I'm going to make a feast. I don't know if I'd say I'm excited, but I'm definitely drinking beer at 9 a.m. Yep.
For lunch, I made up one of those flatbreads that I had made the previous night, mixing up some flour, salt, and water, and frying it in a bit of butter until it was golden. Then I made a very basic apple pottage by dicing up a Granny Smith apple and boiling it until soft. Apples were much more sour in the Middle Ages before we bred them for sweetness, so I used the most sour apple that I could find to replicate this. Once the apples were cooked, I drained them, mashed them, and added in a bit of milk and honey. I paired this with some plain cooked barley and salmon, officially hitting my salmon limit for the week.
Alrighty, so let me show you lunch today. Pretty colorful and appealing, huh? Here we got my apple pottage with curdled milk. This meal is either gonna be just fine or very bad, and I'm not sure which. It's very much not super flavorful applesauce and barley, which, while not particularly a winning combination for me at least, is definitely food. I wanna try a bite of everything together, because I don't think it's gonna go together, but I'm curious, so yeah. I mean, that's definitely not bad. I don't think I'm happy, but I'm not mad. Okay, so we have quick dinner tonight, because as you can see, or I guess as you already would have seen last week, I'm doing something tonight. I heated up the rest of my apple and barley, and then warmed up the barley that I made today, and threw on some parsley, a little bit of pepper, and some apple cider vinegar. So yeah, barley for dinner tonight. Cheers, mates. I think the main thing I've learned this week is that I like barley.
On my final day of this experiment, I decided to mix things up a little bit and eat like a noble would have eaten. And although breakfast was still considered immoral, even for the rich, some nobles were known to break their fast with bread and wine.
I have to show something to you, and it is the fact that I am capable of making bread. It is incredibly hot out of the oven. I told you I could make bread. I can't actually eat that, so I am having a piece of store-bought sourdough. Sue me. This is definitely the earliest I've cracked into a bottle of wine. I love the smell of red wine. Not 100% certain if I love it at 8 in the morning. Very dry wine, and I just brushed my teeth, so I'm having a bit of an experience here. That sure is bread dipped in wine.
So let's talk about my functional bread loaf. That'd make a good band name. I should tell Dylan about that. To be honest, the process was exactly the same as that first loaf of whole grain bread that I had made, the only difference being that this one was made purely from white flour. So I'm left to believe that it was the flour that was the problem, although that doesn't necessarily make me feel any better about myself. Either way, it was a functional loaf of bread, and I was in much higher spirits than I had been through the rest of the week.
Here we have the inside. I need a real bread knife. Very badly. Nope. Please, I've waited so long for this. That's a really good piece of bread, man.
After my early lunch, it was time to get cooking. I based my feast off of one of the most extravagant menus in medieval history, the feast of King Richard II in 1387. Luckily, someone found basically the shopping list from this event, meaning that I had something to go off of. Yeah, I'll just need 14 salted oxen. Okay, that's a lot of oxen, but you know, I was pretty hungry, so that seems fine. All right, and then it's just 120 sheep's heads, okay, 120 sheep's bodies, yeah, that makes sense. 140 pigs, 84 pounds of venison, 144 partridges, 96 rabbits, 12 cranes, 120 cows, and 11,000 eggs. Well, off to the store. For hopefully obvious reasons, I will be making a somewhat pared down version of the original feast. King Richie was feeding 3 full halls of people, but since Dylan and I constitute, I believe, a relatively small slice of that whole population, I am going to be using the menu as inspiration rather than a shopping list. For our first course, we had venison with frumenty, so deer meat with a sweet porridge. All of these recipes will be in the description, but I washed some barley and added almond milk and water before putting that on the stove and allowing all of it to come up to a boil. Almond milk was actually very popular in the Middle Ages. It was seen as a luxurious alternative to milk, and it was particularly useful for the houses of nobles, where you would want to be able to have milk on demand, rather than relying on the fickle souls of cows. In terms of venison, I was unfortunately unable to find any whole pieces in my local grocery store, so I settled for ground venison. I didn't have a recipe for this, so I put it in a bowl and added salt, pepper, and luxurious spices like nutmeg, cinnamon, and ginger before mixing it all together and forming it into this patty sort of thing. Meanwhile, the barley was fully cooked, so I added in some saffron that I had bloomed in hot almond milk. Saffron was, and still is, one of the most expensive spices in the world, and it was used in a lot of high-class medieval dining, especially because it was so noticeable in a dish. Saffron gives food this warm yellow hue, which acted as a visual cue that the founder of the feast was stupid rich. I brought the frumenty back up to a low simmer to finish it off, fried the venison patties, and the first course was served.
So this is venison and frumenty.
There's almost like a sweetness to it.
Also cooked with what we consider Christmas spices now.
Oh.
So like ginger and nutmeg. And then the frumenty is meant to be a sweet porridge.
Oh.
These go surprisingly well together. The fact that the frumenty is sweet, I'm not like the biggest fan of in the world.
When you've had too much wine, it's too big. It's good food. I know you mentioned before we even started eating that it was like gonna be a surprising taste across the board. And it was.
The item I chose for the second recipe was chickens endured, or glazed chicken. Once again, I followed a Max Miller recipe, this time using the video that he made on Sweet Measure, aka capons in milk and honey. As always, go to his channel for the full in-depth recipe, but I'll show you what I did here. I began by taking chicken rather than capon and dredging the pieces in flour. I then browned them in a pan while I combined milk, honey, and herbs like parsley, sage, and saffron in a separate bowl. When the chicken was looking beautiful, I poured in the mixture before covering it and baking for 20 minutes at 350 degrees Fahrenheit. I plated the beautifully glazed chicken on a trencher that I had kind of failed to make a few days earlier, and our second course was served.
So this is a sweet measure. I made it with chicken, though it was originally meant to be made with capon. Do you know what a capon is?
I would assume it has something to do with capers.
It does not.
Well, I'm not used to cutting things with a spoon and a
You can
knife.
put it directly onto your plate, too.
That's not an option. Would you tell King Richard II that he can put it on his plate? No, it would have been on a piece of bread.
So a capon is a chicken that's got no balls. They castrate the chickens in order to make them fatter and apparently better tasting. How are we feeling about the food?
Again, not quite what I was expecting, and yet still very good.
It's all very, very rich. The things I was kind of lamenting this week in terms of how I wanted like fat and sugar and stuff, this is more fat and sugar than I need. I'm enjoying this. That's weird. I wasn't really expecting to.
But this is like almost like fine dining of today. Like the complexity of the flavors and just kind of like the way it is hitting is like almost like I'm eating something from a restaurant.
It's
good work.
It's a delicate sweetness. It is not necessarily my taste palette.
Right, but it's really close.
For our third course, I thought I would choose slightly lighter fare, this time pain puff, or pastry made with cream. Since I also needed something to go into that pastry, I integrated a medieval mincemeat recipe in order to give us some little medieval mincemeat pies. The crust was fairly simple, just sifted white flour, icing sugar, egg yolks, and heavy cream. I apologize that this shot started so blown out, but the flour was so white it was basically glowing. I gently combined this, first with a fork, before working it together with my hands until we had a solid dough. I formed the dough into a disc and let it rest in a cold room while I got to work on the mincemeat. Now, compared to modern mincemeat, medieval mincemeat was much more, well, meaty. The recipe I found contained both pork shoulder and bacon, but I've got to be honest, I took a couple of liberties with this recipe. I ended up only using bacon, finely chopped. I then added red wine, egg yolks, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, salt, and pepper, and then chopped fruit. The recipe called for dates and black currant, but I couldn't find any currants and subbed them out for some dried cherries. The recipe for mincemeat also called for it to be baked for a while in a fully enclosed pie, whereas the tart recipe that I had found had them baking open in pre-cooked shells. So I kinda had to make a call here. I decided to cook the mincemeat in a pot on the stove before placing it to finish in the tarts. I don't entirely know if this was the right call, as things got a little bit, mushy, but you can't win them all. Once I was like 90% sure there wasn't a lot of raw meat in there, I set the mincemeat aside. The dough rolled out fairly nicely, but I didn't have the right pan for this and ended up making weird little tinfoil rings to support the tarts. I baked the crusts alone for a few minutes, and then I added in the mincemeat and baked it until everything was, baked.
Here are our tarts. Don't say it. Wow, this crust is surprisingly flaky. A little bit non-flavorful. Could use some salt. But all in all, for a crust that doesn't have any butter in it, or fat, really, it's looking pretty good.
I do agree that the crust it's good, but there's also very little flavor. It's not that it's bad, it's just that it's not, I would need to eat a lot more of this before I was like, ooh, a mincemeat pie.
It is not necessarily to my tastes, especially because I have fairly modern tastes when it comes to food, but it is still good and it is still surprisingly complex.
I didn't do my bit for the intro bit.
Do you want to do it now?
Let's do it now.
Okay. And I'm here with Dylan.
Hello, I'm Dylan. You might remember me from such hits as Casino and Goodfellas. I was also in The Godfather Part 2. I'm Robert De Niro. I was pretty good in The Irishman. Hello, come back. It's me, Bobby D.
I don't think this is what Richard II was talking about when he was eating this food.
He was more of a Godfather Part 2 kind of guy.
Wait, I just unlocked a childhood memory.
Oh.
We went to a coal mine in like Scotland or something.
1 second.
Because, we were living in England, we were doing things, seeing the sights, and they were having like a Christmas event in this coal mine that involved us going to see Santa. I don't remember much from this event, but I remember that they served mincemeat pies. But this reminds me of the taste of that. Notes on the whole meal, sir?
It's a lot of things that are good, but things that I don't want to eat.
And if anything, this week has taught me that I wouldn't have survived as a medieval peasant because I can't even bake bread.
And I have black lung.
Looking back on this week, it was difficult, but it was a lot of fun. I don't think I was really looking at this as like a challenge, but it kind of ended up being one. The first complaint I have is just how much time I spent cooking. Modern technology allows me to typically only cook once a week and then just slowly chip away at these leftovers throughout the rest of the week. But because I had to be cooking multiple times a day, it felt like I was constantly in the kitchen, either cooking or cleaning or preparing. Managing a full household's other chores on top of that cooking, especially without the help of modern conveniences, would have been way more than a full-time job. Needless to say, I kind of get why you would end up having 15 children to make them help you with your chores. But I think the main thing that I got out of this was this kind of connection to the people that came before me. It is really easy to sit back and look from the place where we are in history and see the people that came before us as these primitive savages. And that's not helped by the portrayal of historical people and lifestyles in media. And I really just don't think that's a fair judgment. They had different perspectives on cleanliness and diet and lifestyle, but just because they did things differently and without the same kind of information that we have about them, that doesn't mean that they got it all wrong. Historical people were still people, and we as a civilization have always found ways to innovate and enjoy our lives, even in something as simple as cooking and eating. I had a ton of fun with this week's video, and I really hope you guys enjoyed going on this little trip through history with me. Please feel free to let me know what I got wrong, or if I was able to help you guys learn anything. I love the discussions I have with you in the comments. They are my favorite part of the day by far. Like this video if you enjoyed it, because it really helps me out, and be sure to subscribe if you like the kind of stuff that I'm doing here. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope that you all have a very happy hobbity day.